Good morning. And let me say something that might genuinely surprise you. Most people think food safety is simple. If it's cooked, it's safe. If it's been in the fridge, reheating it kills whatever needs to be killed, and you're free to eat it exactly the way you did the first time. But what if I told you that for a small handful of everyday foods, the act of reheating itself, not spoilage, not undercooking, the reheating process specifically can change the chemistry of that food in ways researchers have spent years studying in relation to long-term cancer risk. Here's a number I want you to remember. Researchers studying dietary carcinogens have identified several specific compound families, ones with names like heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and nitrosamines that form or increase specifically through repeated heating and reheating of certain foods, not through eating them fresh a single time. These aren't obscure laboratory findings. Several of these compound classes are classified by major health research bodies as probable or possible human carcinogens, and the foods that generate them are sitting in most people's refrigerators right now, waiting for tonight's leftovers. I'm Dr. William Lee. And for years, I've studied how everyday food handling and preparation choices quietly shape long-term health outcomes, often in ways that never make it into standard food safety guidance, because that guidance is almost entirely focused on bacteria and food poisoning, not on this slower, cumulative chemical story. And I need to tell you plainly, several of the most common foods people reheat without a second thought carry a genuinely different risk profile than the guidance most of us grew up with. I want to be upfront about something before we go further, because I think it matters for how you hear the rest of this video. This isn't about any single meal, and it isn't about panic. Cancer risk from diet, in essentially all of the research we're going to talk about today, is a story of cumulative exposure over years and decades, not a story of one reheated dinner causing harm. Think of it less like a light switch and more like a slowly filling glass, where the goal isn't to achieve some impossible standard of zero risk, but simply to understand which everyday habits are adding to that glass faster than they need to, so you can make small adjustments that matter over the long run. So in this video, I'm walking you through 4 specific foods that cancer researchers have flagged in relation to reheating, why the science points in this direction, and exactly what you can do differently starting tonight without giving up these foods altogether. Stay with me until the end because the 4th one has nothing to do with meat or vegetables at all, and it's the one almost nobody thinks to ask about. Let's get into it. The first food is cooking oil that's been used and reheated multiple times, something that happens constantly in home kitchens without anyone realizing it. When oil is heated to high temperatures, especially repeatedly for frying one meal, cooling, then being reused to fry another, it undergoes a chemical breakdown process called oxidation. This process generates a family of compounds called aldehydes, and certain aldehydes, particularly ones formed when oils rich in polyunsaturated fats are repeatedly heated, have been studied extensively for their association with cellular damage and, in some research, with increased cancer risk when exposure is chronic and cumulative over years. The concerning part isn't a single use of oil. It's the pattern many households and restaurants fall into, where the same oil is strained, stored, and reused for frying meal after meal, sometimes for days or weeks, because throwing out oil after one use feels wasteful. Each reheating cycle appears to compound the oxidative damage, meaning the oil used for your 5th batch of fried food carries a meaningfully different chemical profile than the oil used for your first, even though it looks and smells largely the same. Researchers examining this specifically found that oils high in polyunsaturated fat, certain vegetable and seed oils among them, degrade faster under repeated high heat exposure than oils higher in monounsaturated or saturated fat, which tend to be more heat stable across multiple uses. This is part of why so much attention in recent nutrition research has shifted toward oils like olive oil or avocado oil for high heat cooking. Specifically, not because unsaturated fat is inherently unhealthy, but because of how it behaves chemically once you start heating it again and again. The practical fix here is refreshingly simple. Use fresh oil for each significant frying session rather than reusing oil multiple times. If you do reuse oil, limit it to once, strain it well, and store it away from light and heat between uses. And when reheating already fried food, consider using a method that doesn't reintroduce the food to a fresh bath of hot oil. An air fryer or oven works just as well for crisping up leftovers without repeating that oxidative cycle. There's a simple visual and sensory check worth knowing too. Oil that's been overused tends to darken noticeably, thicken slightly, and develop a faint rancid or overly strong smell compared to fresh oil, even before it reaches an obviously spoiled state. If you notice any of those signs, that's a reliable cue that oil has been through more heating cycles than is ideal, regardless of how many times you've technically counted using it. Restaurants and commercial kitchens that fry food constantly are actually held to specific oil quality testing standards in many regions, precisely because this compounding effect is well recognized in food science. It's simply a standard that rarely gets communicated to home cooks doing the exact same thing on a smaller scale. The second food is red and processed meat, specifically when it's reheated using high direct heat methods like a pan grill or broiler rather than gentler methods. This builds on research that's actually well established even before we get to reheating. Charring or high heat cooking of red and processed meats generates two compound families. Researchers have studied closely heterocyclic amines, which form when muscle proteins are exposed to high heat, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which form when fat drips onto a heat source and smoke carries the resulting compounds back onto the meat. Major health research organizations have classified processed meat as a known human carcinogen and red meat as a probable one, based substantially on this cooking chemistry. Here's what most people don't realize. Reheating leftover meat using the same high heat methods essentially repeats this compound formation process a second time. A steak seared once at high heat, then reheated the next day in a hot pan to crisp it back up, has now been through 2 rounds of the exact chemical reactions researchers associate with these compounds, not one. The cumulative exposure from a lifetime of twice cooked meat at high heat is a genuinely different exposure profile than meat cooked once and eaten immediately. The good news is that the fix doesn't require giving up leftover meat. It requires changing how you reheat it. Gentle reheating methods, a covered dish in a moderate oven, a steamer, or even a microwave with added moisture. Don't recreate the same high heat, direct flame conditions that generate these compounds in the first place. You get warm, safely reheated meat without repeating the searing or charring process. That's the actual concern here, not the meat itself, and not reheating in general. Specifically high heat, direct exposure, reheating. I want to be specific about the temperature distinction here because it's easy to hear gentle reheating and worry that means undercooked or unsafe food. That's not what I mean at all. You can and should still reheat leftover meat to a fully safe internal temperature, well above the threshold needed to eliminate bacterial risk. The difference researchers are pointing to isn't about reaching a safe internal temperature, it's about the method used to get there. A covered dish reheated gently in a 300-degree oven until warmed through reaches the same safe internal temperature as meat blasted under a broiler or seared again in a screaming hot pan, but without exposing the surface of the meat to the same direct, intense heat that generates heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in the first place. Same safety outcome, meaningfully different chemistry. The third food is nitrate-rich vegetables, and this one surprises almost everyone, because these are exactly the vegetables most people consider unquestionably healthy: spinach, beet greens, celery, and to a lesser extent, lettuce and other leafy greens. These vegetables naturally contain nitrates, a compound that in its original form isn't concerning and is actually associated with some cardiovascular benefits in fresh vegetables. The issue arises through a conversion process. When these vegetables are cooked, cooled, and then reheated, particularly when reheated slowly or left at intermediate temperatures for a period of time, naturally occurring bacteria and enzymatic processes can convert some of those nitrates into nitrites, and under certain conditions, particularly when combined with proteins during digestion or further heating, nitrates can form nitrosamines, a compound family with a well-established link to cancer risk in research spanning decades. This is precisely why food safety researchers have specifically flagged nitrate-rich vegetables as a category where reheating guidance differs from other foods. It's not that spinach becomes dangerous. It's that the specific practice of cooking a large batch, storing it, and then reheating it again, especially more than once, allows more time and more heat cycles for this nitrate to nitrite to nitrosamine pathway to occur than a single cooking and immediate eating would. The practical guidance researchers generally point to: Cook these vegetables in portions closer to what you'll actually eat that day rather than large batches meant for multiple reheatings. If you do have leftovers, refrigerate them quickly rather than letting them sit at room temperature, which slows the bacterial conversion process, and try to reheat only once rather than repeatedly. None of this means avoiding spinach or beets, foods that are genuinely valuable nutritionally. It means being thoughtful about batch size and reheating frequency, specifically for this category of vegetable. It's also worth mentioning that this same nitrate conversion concern is part of why baby food guidelines in many countries have historically included specific cautions around homemade spinach and beet purees stored and reheated over multiple days, a detail most adults have never heard because it was framed narrowly as infant nutrition guidance rather than a broader principle that applies, to a lesser degree, to anyone regularly storing and reheating these vegetables. The underlying chemistry doesn't change based on age. It's simply that infants are more vulnerable to the effects of nitrite exposure, which is why caution appeared there first, even though the same batch size and freshness principle is reasonable for all of us. And now the fourth food, the one I promised you, has nothing to do with meat or vegetables at all. Grains and starches that have been stored a little too long before being reheated, particularly rice, but also bread, nuts, and grain-based leftovers stored in less than ideal conditions. Here's what makes this one different from the first three. This isn't primarily about a reaction that happens during reheating itself. It's about a toxin that can form during storage before you ever turn the stove back on. And here's the critical detail that catches almost everyone off guard. Reheating does not destroy this particular toxin. Certain molds that can develop on improperly stored grains and nuts, especially in warm, humid conditions or when left at room temperature for extended periods, can produce compounds called mycotoxins, and one specific type, aflatoxin, is classified by major cancer research organizations as a known human carcinogen, one of the most potent naturally occurring ones studied. The dangerous misconception is believing that because heat kills bacteria, heat also neutralizes every risk in old leftovers. Bacterial food poisoning organisms are generally destroyed by proper reheating temperatures. Aflatoxin and several other mycotoxins are remarkably heat stable, meaning they can survive normal cooking and reheating temperatures largely intact. So the danger isn't in the reheating step causing the problem, it's in reheating creating a false sense of safety around food that may have already developed a toxin during storage that reheating simply cannot undo. The practical takeaway here is really about storage discipline rather than reheating technique. Specifically, refrigerate grain-based leftovers, particularly rice, within about 2 hours of cooking, since rice left at room temperature is a well-documented risk factor for both bacterial toxins and, over longer improper storage, mold growth. Store nuts and grains in cool, dry, airtight conditions rather than warm pantries, especially in humid climates. And if you ever notice an off smell, unusual color, or visible mold on stored grains or nuts, the safe choice is to discard that portion entirely. Reheating will not resolve a mycotoxin contamination that's already occurred. I know this one might sound alarming, so let me put it in proper perspective. Aflatoxin contamination at meaningful levels is relatively uncommon in properly stored, commercially sourced grains and nuts in most developed food systems, where monitoring and testing standards exist specifically to catch this. The elevated risk scenario researchers focus on is specifically improper home storage over extended periods, leftover rice sitting out overnight repeatedly, nuts stored in warm, humid pantries for many months, or grains stored in less regulated supply chains. This isn't a reason to fear your pantry. It's a reason to be a little more disciplined about two very specific things: how quickly you refrigerate cooked grains after cooking, and how you store dry grains and nuts before you ever cook them at all. So there you have it, 4 foods. And I want you to notice something that runs through all 4 of these in every single case. The danger isn't reheating itself as a blanket concept. It's specific reheating patterns, high heat, direct methods, repeated cycles, extended storage time, combined with specific food categories that happen to be chemically prone to these particular reactions. Reheating your vegetables once, gently, the same evening you cook them is a completely different scenario than reheating a large batch of spinach for the 3rd time 4 days later. None of this means living in fear of your leftovers or throwing away food unnecessarily. It means understanding these 4 specific categories well enough to make small, informed adjustments. Fresher oil, gentler reheating methods for meat, smaller batches, and quicker reheating for nitrate-rich vegetables, and disciplined storage for grains and nuts cancer risk from diet in the research is almost always about cumulative patterns sustained over years and decades, not about any single reheated meal, which means these small, repeatable adjustments made consistently are genuinely meaningful over the span of a lifetime. If you take away just one habit from this entire video, let it be this: batch size and reheating frequency matter more than almost anything else we discussed today. A smaller portion of food, cooked closer to when you'll actually eat it, reheated once, gently, addresses a meaningful share of the concern across all four categories simultaneously: oil oxidation, meat compound formation, vegetable nitrite conversion, and even grain storage time. You don't need four separate systems in your head for four separate foods. You largely need one underlying habit: cook a little closer to what you'll eat, store what's left quickly and properly, and reheat gently once rather than repeatedly. I also want to address a question I know some of you are already forming. What about the microwave specifically? Since that's how most people actually reheat food day to day. The research here is genuinely reassuring compared to some of the concerns we've discussed. Microwaving works by exciting water molecules within the food itself, rather than applying direct high heat to the surface the way a pan, grill, or broiler does. This means microwave reheating generally does not generate the same heterocyclic amine and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon formation associated with searing or charring, making it, in many respects, one of the gentler reheating methods available for meat specifically. The oil oxidation concern and the nitrate vegetable concern operate through somewhat different mechanisms that aren't primarily about the heating method itself. But for the meat category specifically, your microwave is very likely already one of your better options, not a compromise you need to feel guilty about. My goal with this channel has always been to translate research most people never encounter into information you can actually use in your own kitchen. Not to create fear around food, and not to replace the guidance of your own physician who understands your specific health history and risk factors far better than I can from behind a camera. If you have specific concerns about cancer risk or a family history that concerns you, please raise dietary questions directly with your doctor, who can put this kind of research into the context of your own individual health picture. Now I want to hear from you. Of these four foods, which one genuinely surprised you the most? Leave a comment and let me know which one you're going to change your reheating habits around first. I read every single one, and this community continues to be one of the most engaged and thoughtful I've had the privilege of being part of, and that's entirely because of you. I especially want to hear if any of you grew up in a household, as many of us did, where a big pot of something, rice, a stew, a batch of greens, was cooked once and reheated across several days as a matter of practical necessity, feeding a family on a budget, avoiding waste, simply managing a busy household. I understand deeply that some of what I've shared today runs against those long-standing, practical habits, and I want to be clear that this video isn't a judgment of that way of cooking, which fed generations of families well. It's simply an invitation to bring a little more of today's research into those same practical habits. Smaller batches where reasonable, quicker refrigeration, and gentler reheating, so the tradition can continue while quietly reducing one layer of long-term risk. If this video helped you look at your leftovers a little differently, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because next week, I'm covering something just as important: the specific storage mistake that's quietly shortening the shelf life and safety of the foods most people assume last far longer than they actually do. I'll put a link to a related video right here on the screen if you'd like to go deeper on that topic right now. And if you have a family member, a parent, a grandparent, or even just a roommate who does most of the cooking in your household, consider sending this video their way. So much of what determines long-term dietary risk isn't decided by the person eating the meal. It's decided quietly, meal after meal, by whoever is standing at the stove. Sharing information like this with the person who actually does your household's cooking is often the single most effective thing any of us can do with a video like this one. Take good care of yourself, and take good care of what's sitting in your fridge tonight too. Before we wrap up, I want to add a bit more context on why this particular category of research took so long to reach mainstream food safety guidance, because I think it explains why so many of us grew up never hearing any of this. Most food safety education, the kind taught in home economics classes, printed on packaging, or delivered by public health campaigns, was developed primarily to address acute illness, the kind of food poisoning that makes someone sick within hours or a day. That's an urgent, visible, easily measurable problem, and it rightly became the priority for decades of food safety communication. The research into compounds like heterocyclic amines, nitrosamines, And heat-stable mycotoxins is a different kind of science entirely. It's studying outcomes that unfold over years and decades, that require large population studies and long follow-up periods to detect a signal, and that don't produce an obvious, immediate symptom the way bacterial contamination does. This is precisely why this research, despite being active in scientific literature for a considerable time, still hasn't fully made its way into the everyday food safety advice most people received growing up. It's not that the science is new or fringe, it's that translating slow, cumulative risk research into practical kitchen guidance has simply been a slower process than translating acute illness research, which produces results doctors and researchers can observe within days rather than decades. I share this context because I think it's important for you to understand that what I've walked you through today isn't a warning grounded in uncertainty or speculation. It's simply information that has existed in research literature for years, presented to you here in plain language, specifically so you can make small, informed decisions in your own kitchen starting tonight. Decisions that compound favorably over the years the same way the risks themselves compound when left unaddressed. One last thought before I let you go. I think there's something quietly empowering about this entire topic that's easy to miss underneath the word cancer, which understandably grabs attention and can feel heavy to sit with. Nearly everything I've described today is genuinely within your control, not through expensive supplements, not through eliminating entire food groups, not through complicated rules, but through small, specific, learnable adjustments to habits you already have. Fresh oil instead of oil used 5 times. A gentler pan setting instead of a scorching one for leftovers. A smaller pot of spinach instead of a week's worth. A slightly faster trip to the refrigerator after dinner. None of these require willpower in the way giving up a favorite food does. They simply require knowing they matter. Which is exactly what today's video was for. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and for trusting this channel enough to sit through 20 minutes of research most people never encounter in their daily lives. I don't take that trust lightly, and I'll keep bringing you information like this, translated carefully and honestly, for as long as you keep showing up,